Hello, welcome to a follow-up recording of the Drinking Water Quality and Governance 101 workshop that was held on June 30th. This is a follow-up for those who weren't able to make it in person or who want to revisit the materials that we discussed on the 30th. And as a reminder, this is the first of four drinking water quality focused workshops. The second is a panel on drinking water organizing and advocacy with staff from Community Water Center and self-help enterprises. The third is a tour of a groundwater treatment facility in the city of Santa Monica. And the last one is a deeper dive into topics that you all in the leadership group flag as topics that you want to dig in deeper into with your colleagues and get to talk about more. So without further ado, we can dive into the materials for this workshop. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tori Klug, and I'm with Stantec supporting the Water Talks program with project development and in this way with the community curriculum. So to start, with a land acknowledgement, I am doing this recording from unceded Tongva land, and Los Angeles is the unceded ancestral lands and waters of the Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam people, the original stewards of this land. We recognize that these tribes are still present in this region. We honor their elders, both past and present, and the descendants who are citizens of these tribes for their exemplary respect for water. We honor their continued connection to and protection of one of the most beautiful and diverse landscapes in the world. We also express that acknowledgement of the ancestral homelands alone is not enough, and we seek to uplift the stories, culture, and community of these California Native American tribes and all Indigenous people. So I wanted to start with a discussion of the kind of pathway towards progress on the human right to water in California, and need to start with the kind of drastic drinking water disparities that we have in our state and across the US overall. So more than 2 million people across the US do not have access to safe, clean drinking water, and about 1 million of those people are in California. And there's a lot of evidence of racial and class disparities in drinking water quality and affordability, including disparities in exposure to contaminants in drinking water and in being served by community water systems that are in non-compliance with drinking water quality standards, and also in terms of water debt or being behind on water bills. And also Indigenous households are much more likely to lack access to indoor plumbing than white households. I want to draw your attention to something on the slide here. Throughout the presentation, I have references in some of the text, and at the bottom of the slide, I have the source of some of that information and links given if folks want to dig into a topic in more detail. We'll be providing the slides as well, and you can click on those links and kind of learn and explore more. So the reason we're all here today is because of the Water Talks program, and one of the most pressing concerns flagged in the strengths and needs assessment that we all worked on together was drinking water quality. And as you can see in the map shown on the slide, drinking water quality concerns are really prominent across LA County, and there's kind of differences from community to community. You can see a lot in South LA, a lot of concerns about drinking water quality and maybe a little more mild in the kind of upper San Gabriel River region, but still nonetheless, people are concerned kind of across the board about the quality of their drinking water. And so I wanted to dig into some of the kind of background of that today and kind of start our deeper conversation about drinking water quality across the greater LA County region. So when we think about California drinking water disparities, they're kind of interconnected with and impossible to separate from other structural disparities. And I have this kind of detailed graphic from one of my favorite papers about water justice in California, or about disparities in exposure to drinking water contaminants, because I think that the authors really concisely talk about this issue. And they created this graphic that shows how the natural environment, the built environment, and the socio-political environment are all interconnected and related to drinking water quality. And I provide the link at the bottom of the slide if folks want to engage with that article more directly. But I also wanted to highlight that throughout this presentation, I'm kind of trying to consolidate a lot of different information relevant to drinking water quality into kind of high-level points, so that we could go through all of this in what was a pretty brief workshop a couple of weeks ago, and in this recording is a kind of brief overview of a topic that deserves a lot of attention. So when we talk about the human right to water in California, there have been a lot of different grassroots efforts that have happened over many years to bring attention to drinking water disparities like the ones I mentioned a few minutes ago. And organizations like the Community Water Center, like self-help enterprises, like Leadership Council for Justice Accountability, really bringing this issue to front of mind for a lot of decision makers in the water sector, and kind of wider decision makers on the state level, like the governor's office and the California state legislature. And so a lot of the progress that has been made, or arguably all of it, is due to grassroots efforts that built over many years. And those grassroots efforts led to some global attention in that a UN special rapporteur visited the Central Valley in California and documented the extent to which many communities, mostly those of color, remained without access to safe drinking water and sufficient sanitation. And this really drew a lot of attention globally, and also within the state, to how drastic this issue is, and led to the California state legislature passing the Human Right to Water legislation in 2012, which states that every human being has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. And there have been a lot of discussions kind of about the human right to water and the grassroots efforts that went into that. But I think one kind of really accurate way of describing that was summarized by a former State Water Resources Control Board chair named Felicia Marcus, who said that Californians have outed themselves as having an ongoing water equity problem. And with the human right to water, with establishing that right, we also pointed to the fact that there are a lot of places where the human right to water is not achieved. And the human right to water legislation was described as not, quote, having teeth, in that it didn't say that there were specific kind of enforcement actions related to the human right to water. It's intertwined with a lot of regulatory environment around drinking water quality and the requirements of what community water systems have to do in terms of providing a certain level of drinking water quality. But the human right to water itself didn't establish any new enforcement actions. It didn't establish any new funding sources, but it was used as the foundation for future efforts and future funding sources. And one of the most prominent ones is the passage of SB 200, or the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. So in 2019, just a few years ago, the California State Legislature established the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, which is a $1.3 billion 10-year effort focused on addressing the issues of struggling water systems and of communities who are dependent on on domestic wells that are failing and other failing water sources. And the SADW ties together funds with previously existing funding sources to create what's called the Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience, or SAFER, program. And in fiscal year 2021 to 2022, more than $2.1 billion was earmarked for the SAFER program. So SAFER overall ties together an even larger bucket of resources focused on addressing drinking water challenges throughout the state. And it's implemented through the State Water Resources Control Board, which is kind of the drinking water regulator in the state, and is overseen by, or is guided by, direction from the SAFER Advisory Group, and a photo of that group is shown on the slide. And I think this is kind of key to the program, that a lot of community members who are impacted by drinking water disparities are involved in the advisory group. And play a key role in shaping how the program is being implemented and how SAFER money is being spent. So overall, with kind of the building up of the SAFER program, with the passage of the Human Right to Water, there's kind of a shift in focus at the State Water Board. And it's also resulted in key staff from grassroots organizations that were focused on water justice at those nonprofits moving over to the state board and joining the SAFER team. And there have been some kind of documented progress towards addressing the history of racial injustice in California related to water, and more widely. And the state board actually passed a resolution in 2021 called Condemning Racism, Xenophobia, Bigotry, and Racial Injustice, and Strengthening Commitment to Racial Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Access, and Anti-Racism. And that resolution is linked at the bottom if folks want to read it. It's quite interesting to see the state board acknowledge its own its institutional role in having perpetuated injustice, and articulate a commitment to finding a path forward towards racial equity. And so they're working on a racial equity action plan right now, and there are some virtual workshops coming up for folks to get to share their thoughts on how the state board can commit to key actions towards water-related racial equity. And those are also linked in the bottom. So during our workshop, we broke into discussion groups and chatted about how the human right to water should look in practice, and had a good discussion there. And I think we're going to share the large post-it notes that people were documenting their thoughts on, so those who weren't at the workshop can check those out. And then we also had a discussion on how everyone sees themselves and their organization using the information around the human right to water, around this kind of statewide commitment that has been made. So the next topic we wanted to go into is water system governance. Initially, we were talking about drinking water quality and kind of envisioning what this workshop would look like, and realized that you really can't talk about drinking water quality without talking about who's making decisions over drinking water systems. And thus, this workshop became the Water Quality and Governance 101 instead of just water quality, given how interconnected water quality at the tap is with the decision-making structures that exist. So water system governance, or water governance rather, is the interactions among structures that control decision-making and influence water use and management. And I'm sure we could all think of additional definitions or other ways to kind of define water governance, but that's an example that we can start from. And I think it's really key when we're thinking about water governance in LA County to think about the kind of fragmentation of water systems across the county. And you can see in the graphics shown that there are a lot of water systems of varying sizes across LA. You have LADWP there that's covering a lot of land, and then you have really tiny mutual water companies or investor-owned utilities kind of scattered across the county as well. And we actually have more than 200 water systems, and those are just water suppliers. So the drinking water suppliers that are providing water to households and to businesses and schools. We have a lot of those in the county, and then we also have wholesalers that are selling water to those water suppliers that has been imported from out of state or from other areas in California and taken from those lands. And then we also have wastewater agencies and the flood control district and agencies that govern the groundwater basin that is underneath us. So there are all of these different decision makers, but when we're just thinking about drinking water suppliers, there are already 200 water systems. And there are a few different types of water systems. And if you saw on the last slide, there are those different colors for city systems, for county systems, investor-owned utilities, et cetera. And across the county, mutual water companies are the most common in terms of just number of systems. There are 47 of those, but all of those systems are relatively small, and they actually only serve about 8% of LA County's population. And mutual water companies are a kind of interesting structure overall. They're defined as cooperatives where landowners who receive water are both member owners and water users. So that's where either landlords or if folks own the houses that they live in, those homeowners would have a say in who is on the board of that mutual water company and in key decisions. But in a lot of cases, renters are served by mutual water companies and might not have a direct say unless, in some rare cases, landowners will allow their renters to vote by proxy, which is kind of an interesting example of allowing the people who are impacted by the water system to have a say in its decisions. So about half, or over half rather, of people in LA County are served by a city-run system, and over 1/3 of people in the county are served by Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or LADWP specifically, given that it covers all of the city of LA, and the city of LA makes up so much of a proportion of LA County's population. So you can see that city-run systems are kind of right behind mutual water companies in terms of the number of systems, but they make up a lot more of the population served. And then you have investor-owned utilities. So these are companies like Golden State Water and Cal Water that have different districts across the state. And they have several districts in LA County that serve water. They have a kind of different structure. So we already have the 200 water systems across LA County that kind of represent the fragmentation of our water systems. But then we also, even within specific individual water systems, there can be a kind of further breakdown of service areas. Largely, they're classified by the type or the specific source of drinking water served in each area. So the map shown on the slide is of LADWP's water quality service areas. And in the Consumer Confidence Report, or Drinking Water Quality Report they put out every year, They provide information on drinking water quality in each of these service areas. And the reason they're different is they have a different kind of combination of sources from the State Water Project, which is water that's imported from Northern California, the Colorado River Aqueduct, which is water taken from the Colorado River, the LA Aqueduct, which is taken from what's now known as the Owens River Valley, and then a lot of LADWP's area is served by local groundwater as well. So groundwater that they pump from the underlying groundwater basin. So this is kind of like a further level to which there can be differences in water quality and the origin of water in or across the county. So as I mentioned before, water quality is kind of is interconnected with governance. There are a few reasons why that is. A few impacts that governance has on water are related to transparency. So some types of water systems are required to have public meetings, are required to share certain information out to the community served by their water systems, and others have kind of different structures. There's also differences in the selection of leadership of water systems. So some like city-run systems, the city council or the city governing body is the kind of those are the elected leaders of the water system too. And in other cases, say for investor-owned utilities, those leaders can be appointed. So it's not necessarily the case that people served by the system have a say in who runs it. And that differs based on the type of water system. There's also some more recent studies showing relationships between water system performance, so how reliably they're providing safe water, and their governance structure. And there's, I think, one article linked in the speaker notes, which we'll also send out to all of you if you'd like to look at that on kind of that relationship between performance and water systems. But one of the findings is that city-run water systems are much less likely to violate drinking water quality standards than some of the other water governance structures. And then lastly, or the last thing I want to point out, although I think we could probably talk about more governance impacts, there are ways that the water system structure impacts the potential for affordability programs, and specifically privately owned water systems are actually required to have low income rate assistance, and those are governed through the California Public Utilities Commission, whereas public water systems like a city-run system has a kind of different structure, and they actually are kind of kept from their rules against them having affordability programs, because they are prevented from using rates raised in one area of their service area to subsidize users in another area. So there's kind of this interesting set of restrictions around affordability programs, and there's some right now statewide advocacy to have kind of a state level low income rate assistance program, so that everyone, regardless of water system governance structure, can have access to support for paying their water bills, so that they don't have water shutoffs or aren't incurring debt because their water bill is higher than they can afford. So that's a key thing to pay attention to too. And the graphic shown here is from the Luskin Center at UCLA's water system governance map, and it shows the average water bill, monthly water bill across the county. And you can see a lot of kind of variation in how much people are paying for water. And you can dig into those details a little bit more if you want, I have the link here to the Luskin Center's water governance mapping tool, and you can look at the water system governance type. You can look at information on average water bill, on kind of size of water systems. They also have links to consumer confidence reports, so you can learn more about drinking water quality in the system that serves you or other systems of interest. And kind of learn more about systems across the county. This is a really useful tool that compiles a lot of information that was kind of spread out across other platforms before, but now it's all in one place for easier review. So we also developed a infographic illustrating the pathway to TAP for kind of a generalized water system. And I think we're going to have the PDF of these uploaded onto the Water Talks Leadership Group resources folder on Google Drive. So you can check it out in that form. But wanted to go through it as a part of this recording as well. So we started with water sources, and in LA, there are kind of two main water sources. The most common one, or the largest contributor, is imported water. And as it says on the infographic, currently most of LA County's water supply is imported. Importing surface water is energy intensive, vulnerable to climate change impacts and earthquakes, and involves a continued taking of ancestral waters of indigenous peoples. And so for the city of LA, our main source of imported water is the LA Aqueduct that takes water from what is now called the Owens River Valley in the kind of eastern Sierras. And then there are other sources like the Colorado River Aqueduct and the State Water Project that are imported through Metropolitan Water District. And then another key portion of our water supply as a county is groundwater basins. And some water systems are entirely reliant on groundwater. So they just have a set of groundwater wells and they pump them to supply water for their community. And as we know on the infographic, to make LA County more resilient, there are efforts to remediate groundwater basins that were contaminated by industrial pollution and to infiltrate more stormwater to replenish groundwater basins. So there are kind of a lot of efforts related to groundwater. There's a lot of rules about the exact amount of groundwater that each water supplier is allowed to pump. Most of the groundwater basins in LA County are adjudicated, which means that there's been a lawsuit that basically led to having a very strict set of pumping allocations for each water supplier, and water suppliers have to operate within that amount. And then there's continuous efforts to help replenish groundwater basins by having stormwater infiltration and things to allow us to add water to the basins as people are pumping water out, so that that's kind of a balanced equation. So after the water source, there's a water treatment system, and imported water and groundwater must be treated before it's consumed, and treatment is designed based on source water quality to kill or remove harmful bacteria, viruses, metals, and/or organic compounds. And the extent of treatment really depends on how contaminated or how dirty water is. Some groundwater sources that are relatively clean just need disinfection to make sure that bacteria aren't making their way to people's taps and making them sick. So sometimes there's just disinfection, and sometimes there's treatment systems that are designed to remove contaminants that might be present in the source water. So then we have, after the treatment system, water traveling through an underground pipe system or distribution system. And to deliver safe, clean water, a distribution system requires maintenance that includes replacing old pipes and maintaining consistent non-corrosive water chemistry. And corrosion is the gradual deterioration of metal surfaces and can impact water quality. Pipe material and key water chemistry components like pH impact the rate of corrosion in distribution systems. So it's really key for water systems to have the ability to properly maintain their distribution system, so it's not contributing metals to water. There are different ways to do that. Some are, as it says, maintaining non-corrosive water chemistry. It's also making sure that there aren't dangerous metals present in the distribution system, and there are a lot of statewide efforts to, say, remove lead from distribution systems to make sure that it can't possibly be added to water. And then there's premise plumbing after water travels across the property line. So premise plumbing is like within a house or within a school, within a business, and it's the pipes within a property line with direct connection to the drinking water supply system. And water flows from underground pipes onto premises such as homes. And at this point, water quality becomes the property owner's responsibility. So it's no longer kind of in the water supplier's court to take care of water quality at that point. Then we highlighted a couple of issues on the infographic that included iron and manganese, that are minerals that can give water an unpleasant taste, odor, and reddish brown color. We'll talk about manganese a little bit more later. Groundwater can contain both iron and manganese in that source water, and iron can also leach into the water supply from corroded iron pipes and give it that discoloration. Lead is another concern, and when water passes through old corroded lead pipes and pipe fittings, lead can leach into drinking water, which is something that should be avoided by, as I said before, maintaining the water system or the distribution system and maintaining a safe non-corrosive water chemistry. And the last thing I'll highlight is that water quality at the tap is impacted by everything upstream: premise plumbing, distribution system, piping, treatment system, and the water source. A functioning water system takes good care of its water source, makes sure it knows what's present in the water source, good care of its treatment system and its distribution system, and then ideally premise plumbing is also safe to maintain safe water at the tap. And there are a few solutions there that we highlight that are some of which are related to the projects that we're developing through Water Talks. So now that we've kind of learned a little bit more about the pathway to the tap, talking through a little bit about regulated drinking water contaminants. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulates a whole suite of contaminants that fall into these different buckets of microorganisms, inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, radionuclides, disinfection byproducts, and disinfectants. And we'll go into those in a little bit of detail in a few minutes. But first, we want to talk a little bit about the kind of authority that the EPA has to regulate those contaminants and how state level agencies also have a role in that regulatory process. So in 1974, Congress passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, or the SDWA, which gives the EPA authority to set national health-based standards for drinking water. And so the EPA kind of has the foundational nationwide ability to do so. And after 1974, there were substantial amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1986 and 1996, some of which had a lot of focus on lead in drinking water plumbing. So trying to reduce the potential for lead to be present in distribution systems and in premise plumbing to keep people's water safe. And there's a lot of other good, important details in those amendments that we could go into at another time. But below the EPA, there's what are called primacy agencies that have responsibility for implementing the Safe Drinking Water Act within their boundaries. So those include states, territories, and the Navajo Nation. There's kind of a process for establishing or becoming a primacy agency, and the only Native nation that has gone through that process and been approved to exercise primary responsibility in their jurisdictions. That last part was a quote from the SDWA, is the Navajo Nation. And this is something that some Indigenous water lawyers spend a lot of time thinking about, how to allow or how other Native nations can kind of become a primacy agency within their own area. Because the EPA currently implements the Safe Drinking Water Act on all other tribal lands. So within the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA and primacy agencies have the responsibility for regulating all public water systems, and those have a few different characteristics. They're defined as systems that provide water for human consumption that have 15 or more service connections or regularly serve at least 25 individuals daily for at least 60 days of the year. So it's kind of the vast majority of water systems. There are some really small ones that fall outside of that area, so for really rural communities, but by and large, when we think about a water system, we're thinking about a public water system. And even beyond that, if you look at the kind of infographic at the right, there's this further categorization within public water systems to community water systems, transient non-community water systems, and non-transient non-community water systems. And almost all of the systems that we're thinking about are community water systems. There's some, say, in a rural area where a gas station has a well that they are using to supply water for their bathroom and for a drinking fountain, say, that could be a transient non-community water system, and they have slightly different rules, but basically almost all of the water systems that we'll be thinking about as a group are community water systems. So I wanted to kind of set that context. And so in California, the primacy agency that implements the Safe Drinking Water Act is the State Water Resources Control Board, and in particular, they have their Division of Drinking Water that is the water system regulator in the state. And there are a few key definitions to know when thinking about drinking water regulations. And one is the maximum contaminant level goal, or MCLG. This is the level of a contaminant at which there would be no risk to human health. And the EPA determines this level based on research. So they have a bunch of kind of health studies related to contaminants that might be present in water to determine what the MCLG would be. And then in California, we have our own process for setting a public health goal. And that's just the California specific version of the MCLG. And it's set by what's called OEHA, or the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And then, so after an MCLG or PHG is set, a maximum contaminant level can be set, and that's the highest level of a contaminant that is allowed in drinking water. And those are set to be as close as possible to the MCLG or PHG, but with kind of economic and technical feasibility added on as a kind of additional lens. So if the maximum contaminant level goal of a contaminant is 0, but there's no treatment systems that can actually treat water down to 0, like 0 micrograms per liter of that contaminant, the maximum contaminant level might be higher than the maximum contaminant level goal because we don't have the technology to reach that goal. But in the future, we might, and the State Water Board in California and the EPA revisit maximum contaminant levels to see if there's been kind of technological innovation that would allow the MCL to be set closer to the MCLG. Then there's what are called secondary maximum contaminant levels. So when we talk about just maximum contaminant levels, we're usually talking about primary maximum contaminant levels, and those are for contaminants that are considered to have potential negative impact on human health, or actually have kind of documented evidence of negative impact on human health. Whereas secondary maximum contaminant levels are considered by regulators to have a negative aesthetic or cosmetic influence on people through like impairments of taste, odor, or appearance of water. So they kind of have a separate process of being set and are treated fairly differently, and we can talk about that in more detail. The last thing to kind of flag for you is if you're looking at a drinking water quality report, you might see a treatment technique called out, or TT, and this is when a process is required to reduce the level of a contaminant in drinking water, but there's no actual maximum contaminant level for it. It's used, TT is used in the place of a maximum contaminant level for contaminants that are unlikely to be detected because they're really rare, but they are proven to be removed by certain technologies. So now that we kind of know the definitions, we can talk a little bit about that process more. So once contaminants or once it's known that contaminants have a negative impact on human health, then there's like toxicological or health research that demonstrates that. And there's also data showing that that contaminant is present in water sources. The EPA at a federal level and the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment can go through their process of setting a maximum contaminant level goal and a public health goal, respectively, for each. And then once those goals are set, the EPA and the California State Water Board can set their maximum contaminant levels. And I have this arrow going from the EPA's MCL to the California State one because the California State Water Board has to set MCLs to be at least as strict as the US EPA's MCLs. So they can't say if the EPA sets a maximum contaminant level at 0.05 micrograms per liter for a specific contaminant, the California State Water Board can decide to set an MCL that's stricter. So they could say, we want to set it at 0.01 micrograms per liter. So they only allow an even smaller amount, but they can't set it at say 1 microgram per liter. That's not allowed. They have to at least be as stringent as the US EPA, but they have the authority to be stricter. And there's a little bit more nuance to this process. If you want to learn more, there's a bunch of links at the bottom of the slide that you can look at to get more familiar with the details, but this is kind of the high level idea. And then when we think of secondary standards, which I mentioned a moment ago, the EPA sets these for contaminants that they may consider to cause cosmetic effects or aesthetic effects in drinking water. And across the US, water systems are recommended but not required to comply with secondary standards. But primacy agencies can choose to make those secondary standards enforceable. And in California, the State Water Board considers secondary standards to be, quote, necessary to protect the public welfare, and thus has kind of an enforcement process for secondary MCLs, but they follow a slightly different path than primary MCLs. So we've been talking about a lot of different contaminants and kind of the regulatory process. And the way that a lot of people interact with those regulations is through their consumer confidence report or their drinking water quality report that their water system is required to put out every year. So this is a document that needs to be compiled by all community water systems, regardless of size. And they are specifically required to include data for all regulated drinking water contaminants that are detected in the water system. And they also include some other helpful information that's shown here, like where your water comes from. So a specific lake or river or a groundwater basin or imported water, where that comes from as well. And then they also are required to document the potential health effects from consuming contaminated water and to share additional potential safeguards against water-related illness. And they, for any drinking water contaminants that are regulated, that are detected in the water, they are required to share their levels, or the detected levels in the water system next to the maximum contaminant level and the maximum contaminant level goal or public health goal. So it's a really useful document. I know I've talked to a few of you about kind of reviewing your drinking water quality reports for the system that serves your home, or for those that serve those water systems that serve communities that you're engaged with. And this is kind of the key way to learn how a water system is doing in terms of drinking water quality provision. And there are a few links at the bottom about understanding your drinking water quality report, and also kind of a reference guide about what's required for water systems. So I mentioned before that we would get back to talking about specific types of regulated drinking water contaminants, and now is that moment. So there are these 6 different categories of regulated water contaminants, and we'll kind of go through category by category. So microorganisms include bacteria, protozoa, and viruses, and you can see in the picture at the right kind of the relative size of those different regulated contaminants, along with helminth, which is a little different, but they're really small and have to be either kind of have the water source protected against their presence. So for drinking water wells and groundwater basins, having a healthy filter pack around the well that kind of filters out potential bacteria from entering the well is really key. And then for surface water sources, or like rivers, lakes, aqueducts, it's often required to have water filtration or other treatment processes to remove different kind of portions of drinking water, including microorganisms. And a good indication of how clean a drinking water source is turbidity, or the kind of cloudiness of the water. And that's often used to verify whether or not water filtration processes are doing their job. The next category is, or actually one more thing on microorganisms. When there is a boil water advisory for a water system, it's often because of concerns about bacteria entering a water system. And how that most often happens is if there's like a big break or a leak in a distribution system, because water systems in general are kept under pressure so that any bacteria that might be present in the ground around distribution system pipes can't enter the water system because there's kind of pressure pushing outward. But if there's a big break in a pipe that's delivering water throughout a water system, water systems will often in certain instances, they're required to publish a boil water advisory so that people can boil water and kill any microorganisms that might be present in the water, and thus their water would be safe to consume. So that's pretty much only for microorganisms. Boiling water doesn't help to, say, remove metals or organic chemicals or anything like that. It's really focused on bacteria. And then the next category of contaminants is inorganic chemicals, and that includes metals and nitrate or nitrite, and a few other chemicals. So these can be present in the source water, so in a groundwater basin or in a surface water source, but they also can be present in the pipes. So that would be like iron and lead and things that might actually be a component of pipes. Often the presence in source water is because of industrial contamination, and they also, these chemicals can be naturally occurring. So things like arsenic, which is a really important contaminant to address in terms of potential impact on human health. Arsenic is actually fairly common in groundwater basins, and thus kind of there's nowhere to point in terms of blame in a lot of cases with arsenic. And in California, arsenic and nitrates and perchlorate are the inorganic chemicals that most commonly exceed their maximum contaminant level and have to be treated or addressed in another way. Next category is organic chemicals, and this includes contaminants from agriculture, so like herbicides and pesticides and insecticides are a large portion of the organic chemicals that are regulated in drinking water. And this can also include contaminants from, or it also includes industrial and chemical factories contaminants as well. And if you remember, back on the slide a while back, I'll just flip there now, gone through all of it. Organic chemicals are the group at the right there. So it's the largest list of regulated drinking water contaminants compared to the others. So there's a lot of organic chemicals that are regulated. This is kind of where more emerging contaminants are often identified because there are so many different chemicals that have been used in the agriculture and industrial processes. Next category is radionuclides, which might sound kind of scary and should be addressed when they're present, but they often are actually just from also natural sources. So there's a certain amount of uranium that's present in the Earth's surface, and you can see in the picture at the right, there's kind of variation in the uranium concentration. You can see in the legend, the like yellow areas are moderate, red is high, but the blue and greens are low in terms of uranium. And the kind of natural degradation of those deposits can lead to radionuclides in water in some areas, and that's something that's monitored in water systems as well to make sure that they are protective. And there are a few different screening measurements that are used to detect radionuclides, like gross alpha activity and gross beta activity. So those are regulated contaminants that are required to be reported in consumer confidence reports as well. Then the next category is disinfectants. And these are mostly used, or they are entirely used to prevent waterborne disease due to the presence of microorganisms. So disinfectants can be used to either kill or inactivate bacteria and other microorganisms that are dangerous to humans. Disinfection of drinking water is widely considered one of the most important advances in public health, and led to a substantial decrease in the incidence of waterborne disease across the globe. And using disinfectants appropriately is a great way to keep people safe. It's really important to maintain an appropriate level of disinfectant. So there's disinfectant that's dosed to like kill any bacteria that might be present in the water, like at the treatment plant. And then there's also what's called a residual that's maintained to help protect against any microorganisms that might be present in pipes between the treatment system and when someone drinks a glass of water. So having the right level of residual helps to prevent against disease from microorganisms, but there's also the need to keep disinfectant level below a certain level to avoid negative impacts. And that's why there's a maximum residual disinfectant level. And that is basically set to be protective against disinfection byproducts, or DBPs, which are created when disinfectant is combined with organic matter in water to create either bromate or chlorite or haloacetic acids or total trihalomethanes. It's kind of this category of things that are basically disinfectant reacting with other things present in water. And there are kind of a few key ways to prevent the creation of disinfection byproducts. One is having the right level of disinfectant applied. Another really key one is making sure that water is already clean enough before disinfectant is added. So that's why disinfectant is kind of the last step of a lot of treatment processes, because there's other things that happen upstream to make sure that anything that might react with the disinfectant is removed beforehand, so that disinfection byproducts cannot be created. And then for groundwater wells, it's really important for those to be well maintained, so there's not sand and other matter making its way into the well itself and into the water that's being pumped from the well. And then the last note is that the type of disinfectant used can impact the formation of disinfection byproducts, which is why a lot of water systems have been kind of switching to chloramines for their disinfection byproduct to reduce the potential for disinfection byproduct creation. So the moral of the story is that disinfectants need to be set at the right level and be surrounded by the right treatment processes and the right source water protection. So we've been talking about the suite of regulated contaminants, but there are a few kind of special contaminants that I want to talk about in a little bit of detail. Those, to start, are lead and copper. So there is kind of special treatment of lead and copper, given the fact that it's usually present or usually contributed to in the drinking water distribution system or in premise plumbing, as opposed to just mostly being from source water or from like a groundwater basin or surface water that might be the source of drinking water for a community. And so there's kind of a different approach to regulating and monitoring for lead and copper in a water system. So water systems are required to take a set of tap water quality samples for lead and copper and test them for lead and copper levels. And then they are required to take action to prevent or to reduce levels of lead and copper if they exceed what's called an action level. Specifically if they exceed that action level with a certain number or a certain percent of their tap water samples. And so if the action level is exceeded, the water system might have to put in place corrosion control treatment, which can be kind of conditioning the water so that corrosion is less likely to happen in the distribution system and premise plumbing. There are corrosion inhibitors that can be added to water to basically like create a like little chemical liner of a or of distribution system piping. There's also kind of source water monitoring and treatment that can happen. Water systems can also be required to replace lead service lines, which has been kind of in the national attention a lot recently, given the Biden administration's focus on lead service line replacement and funding for those projects. And then lastly, on public education, on things like flushing water at the tap if water has been stagnant for a long time, or basically a drinking water fountain or a sink has not been used for several days, or especially like weeks or months, more corrosion can happen and more metals can be added to that water. So allowing for a few minutes of flushing after water is kind of left stagnant for a long time can be a key way to reduce lead and copper levels at the tap. So that's a little bit about the lead and copper rule. In California, there have been a few specific actions related to lead and copper, including testing requirements for K through 12 public schools and for childcare facilities. And I linked at the bottom the State Water Board pages about those testing programs. There are mapping tools for the K through 12 testing that you can check out. You can see what schools have gone through testing and shown no issues, which that's the gray dots across the county there, which is kind of comforting overall that a lot of these schools have had tap testing done for lead and have shown to be below the action level. There are a few places where actions needed to be taken, so replacing drinking water fountains or adding treatment systems, etc. And then there's also a requirement for community water systems to provide an inventory of lead or unidentified user service lines and have a timeline for replacing those lead service lines or unidentified service lines to really remove lead from the picture. And then lastly, on both a California level and on a statewide level, there's been a series of laws preventing the use of plumbing materials containing lead, which is really a key action to make sure that lead is not making its way into our drinking water systems anymore. So the other contaminant I wanted to talk about a little bit has kind of a separate regulatory structure. I know we've talked about it as a group a good bit. But that's manganese. It has a secondary MCL because it's considered by regulators to have aesthetic or discoloration concerns and not be tied to health concerns. That secondary MCL is 0.05 micrograms per liter, or milligrams per liter, sorry. And then there's separately, interestingly, for manganese, a notification level that is actually added to be protective of human health. And that is 10 times higher than the secondary MCL, or 0.5 milligrams per liter. And that kind of shows that there are different levels of manganese, some which could cause kind of light discoloration in water and be kind of unpleasing to see in your drinking water for understandable reasons. But then there's also some growing evidence of especially of very high levels of manganese having a negative impact on human health. And that notification level was set to try to be protective of that. There's also a current process underway at the State Water Board to reflect or to potentially update the notification level of manganese and kind of attention to manganese at a statewide level, given its prominence in communities across California, especially in LA County. In summary, there's kind of this distinct regulatory structure for manganese. There's a recognition that at very high levels, which are not often seen in drinking water, but can be seen in drinking water, that it can have a negative impact on human health. But at lower levels, the regulators still see it as primarily a discoloration issue. And again, happy to discuss this one more. There's a lot of nuance here that is hard to encapsulate in a slide. The last point is that a lot of California's drinking water sources have kind of low levels of manganese present because manganese is naturally occurring in groundwater basins themselves. It's fairly widespread. So to kind of wrap up our regulations discussion, wanted to point to a few potential upcoming regulations that if you are interested in kind of understanding how this process goes or in engaging in this process, to draw attention to kind of how these contaminants might impact your communities. There are potential new regulations coming up for what are called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, that are kind of industrial contaminants that have been detected across California overall, but in Orange County a lot, in LA County to an extent as well. There's also, last thing on PFAS is that the state board has set notification levels and response levels that aren't quite stringent MCL, or quite as stringent as MCLs, but prompt certain water system actions. And they're in the process of kind of getting enough information to set an MCL, and the potential for PFAS MCLs is kind of likely in the future. And PFAS are a suite of compounds, so there would be a suite of MCLs, one set for each individual compound, likely. Then there's also likely new regulations for 1,4-dioxane as well. And then one contaminant that kind of has an interesting history in California is hexavalent chromium. It previously had a California MCL, but that was set in 2014, but it was withdrawn in 2017 after a court decision that said that the MCL did not adequately consider the cost impacts on small water systems. So that's really where the difference between an MCLG, or the maximum contaminant level goal, and the maximum contaminant level becomes really key. Because if a maximum contaminant level, the kind of regulatory standard, is set to be so stringent that water systems might not be able to afford treatment to remove it, it's possible that it will be struck down by the courts. Again, a lot of nuance here. Happy to talk about that more. Then another thing to pay attention to is the US EPA and state water boards monitoring for new contaminants. There's something that happens every few years called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR, where the EPA sets a list of contaminants that they're kind of seeing might have a negative impact on human health, but they want to understand how often they're present in the water sources of public water systems. And so they require a bunch of public water systems, kind of the majority of public water systems, but with specific criteria about who has to. They're all required to sample for those contaminants so the EPA can understand how common they are. And then the last thing I mentioned a minute ago, but I want to mention again, is the upcoming revision of manganese notification and response levels. And I have a link to the webpage on that for the State Water Board at the bottom of this slide. So the last thing that we kind of had to speed through during the in-person workshop on the 30th was thinking about some ways that water system performance is assessed. Earlier on in the Water Talks project development process, there's some discussion about a kind of water system report card, similar to how restaurants have their public health report card, like their A or B or C rating. And there isn't something kind of as cut and dry as that, but there are some kind of statewide and more local assessments of water systems that I wanted to briefly go over to kind of think about the criteria that they use and think about the information that they compile that might be useful in understanding what water system serves your community, and potentially like reflecting on that information. So through SAFER, the first statewide assessment of drinking water systems in California happened in 2021. And that was focused on small water systems with less than 3,300 connections, as well as K through 12 public schools that have their own water system that aren't like served by a larger one. And then this year was the second statewide needs assessment, and that expanded the systems that were assessed to small and medium sized water systems. So it's any system that has fewer than 30,000 service connections. So it's a lot more, but systems like LADWP weren't included because that is a very large system. And they kind of refined some of the criteria that they use for categorizing water system performance. And this is really useful in guiding state level action and in shedding light on some of the kind of challenges of water systems or some of the difficulties that they're facing, but it's not able to tell the full story of a water system. So there's a lot of kind of nuance in how a water system's doing that can't necessarily be distilled down to a few criteria. And within the statewide needs assessment, water systems are categorized into these 4 different categories. Failing is the kind of worst case. Then there's at risk, then potentially at risk, and not at all at risk. And if you look at this map of LA County, in the greater LA County area, down here, there's actually just one system that's considered failing. There's a few that are considered at risk, a few that are potentially, but the vast majority are considered to not be at risk or to be reliably providing safe drinking water. But if you look up in the kind of Antelope Valley and Santa Clarita area, there are more water systems with kind of more extensive difficulties. So that list of failing systems is often referred to as a human right to water list. This is really the priority of the State Water Board and where they are most focused in terms of investing resources. And there's a kind of set of criteria for getting on the human right to water list. One is having a primary MCL or a maximum contaminant level that's set based on health standards, having a violation with an open enforcement action for a primary MCL, same for a secondary MCL, and also for bacteria violations, and then also for treatment technique violations, so not having the right treatment in place or treatment not operating as it should. And lastly, for monitoring and reporting violations, and all water systems are required to submit certain data to the State Water Board to make sure that, or so that the State Water Board can verify that they are providing safe water. And if systems are failing to report the right data, they can end up on the human right to water list because the State Board basically doesn't know if they are or are not reliably providing safe water. And you can see across the state, the vast majority of the systems assessed, so all of those small and medium sized water systems, all of those or the vast majority of those are not at risk. And then there's kind of a few hundred potentially at risk, about 500 at risk, and about 350 water systems are failing or on the human right to water list. And the vast majority of those are fairly small, and thus the population impacted is fortunately not as extensive as it could be. But still, not to minimize the issue, there are still a lot of people who are served by failing water systems. The risk indicator categories that the state board uses fall into these 4 categories. So water quality, accessibility, affordability, and technical, managerial, financial capacity. And those are broken down into all of these different specific indicators. And the ones highlighted were added in the second year of the needs assessment. So they realized that, say, for affordability, it was really important to note how many water systems had substantial arrearages, or people who owed money on their water bill in the past or on past water bills. So they incorporated that into their affordability assessment. They removed a few indicators as well, and are kind of in the process of refining their risk indicators. But you can see how the state board at least thinks of water system performance. I'm sure we could have a discussion about kind of other indicators that might be useful here. And a great way to plug into that discussion is by going to the state water board safer affordability, or sorry, the safer advisory groups quarterly meetings, and commenting on the needs assessment and that process. So for the failing water systems, or the human right to water systems, the state board shared a kind of breakdown of what contaminants put them on that list. So you can see at the left is primary MCLs, and the right is secondary. And arsenic is the most common contaminant that puts systems on the human right to water list. And those are a lot of systems in the Central Valley, and some in LA County that are kind of in the Santa Clarita and Antelope Valley area struggle with arsenic in their water source as well. There's also a lot of 1,2,3 trichloropropane exceedances, and this is a newly regulated, or relatively newly regulated, contaminant in California. It's an MCL that California has that the US EPA does not, and that a lot of water systems are still struggling to add treatment to be in compliance with this MCL. Then on the secondary MCL side of things, manganese is by far the most common contaminant that puts systems on the human right to water list. And this is kind of for the reasons I discussed before about manganese being really common in source water, and water systems kind of having challenges related to removing manganese. It's also, manganese can kind of accumulate in a distribution system, so it can cause some issues that way. Then iron is the second most common. And then the last thing I wanted to kind of flag for everyone in terms of water system performance is that there are some LA County focused assessments that have happened, and there's a paper linked at the bottom, and this graphic is from that paper that assesses primary MCL violations by county across California, and this is for data between 2005 and 2017. And if you look at the different lines, you can see that like Fresno County and Kern County and let's see, Tulare County have this kind of bulk of MCL exceedances or violations, and LA County is relatively low in terms of primary maximum contaminant level violations. Still an issue, but not as as kind of concentrated as an issue as it is in the Central Valley. And that's part of the reason why there's been so much focus on drinking water disparities in the Central Valley, because so many communities are impacted by contaminants that can have a negative impact on human health, especially in those areas. And then also, if you break this data down by population as well, or the per capita violations of primary maximum contaminant levels, you can see that LA County has an even kind of lower rate of violations. Again, don't want to minimize the issue, still an issue, but there are fewer violations here than elsewhere in the state. And that's part of the reason why there's a lot of attention paid to other places. And in this paper that I was drawing some figures from, there's an assessment of water systems in a slightly different way than the state needs assessment had. And there's this categorization of systems that have no apparent cause for performance concern. They have kind of no key violations nor any strong risk indicators. And that's about half of the water systems in LA County that fall into that no apparent cause for concern category. And then there's some that have a minimal cause for concern. They might kind of have affordability or have like affordability risk indicators, or kind of light indication of cause for concern, but not substantial. And it kind of steps through here. And there are only 15 systems that are on this acute performance concern list. And a lot of those are because of arsenic violations, again, and that's around the Santa Clarita Valley and Antelope Valley. So I wanted to kind of end on a note of thinking about drinking water solutions. So as we think about the different challenges faced by water systems in their communities across the state, about the ways to address those challenges. There are some that are kind of a focus on state level, but I think there's a lot more that we could talk about as a group. But things like water system partnerships are receiving a lot of attention right now. Those could look like consolidations between water systems, so that smaller water systems that are struggling to provide reliable, safe drinking water can be supported by well-established water systems. There's also obviously funding for infrastructure, for new treatment systems, for replacing old pipes that might be corroded, and say adding iron to the water system. There's potential to drill new wells that might not be pulling from contaminated areas of a groundwater basin. There's also opportunities to increase the representativeness of leadership of water systems and transparency in decision making, so that community members have a say over how their water systems are governed and the decisions that are made that impact them. There's also a lot of opportunity for capacity building for water system staff. So where there's not a need for new infrastructure, there are ways that operations and maintenance of water systems can be improved to more reliably provide safe drinking water. And there's also a real need for affordability programs, so that folks who are currently burdened by really high water bills can have relief from that burden. And there's some statewide advocacy focused on that, that folks could plug into if desired. So this was, again, a kind of follow-up recording of the Drinking Water Quality and Governance Workshop. I hope it is useful to some of you, and as always, feel free to reach out if you have questions. And then I just want to flag for everyone to be thinking about what they want to talk about for the final Drinking Water Quality Workshop that'll probably take place around the end of August or early September. and is an opportunity for us to dive deeper into topics of interest to the leadership group, and potentially to bring in other folks who can talk about key topics with us, and get to wrap up our drinking water quality workshop series. So that is it from me. This recording will be going out alongside the slides. So all those links that you got to see during this presentation, you can follow those and dig into those resources a bit more. But thank you so much, and I will see you soon.